I'm David Highfill, and on behalf of the Spencertown Academy, I want to welcome you to the 2021 Virtual Festival of Books. We're delighted to be here. We're very fortunate tonight to have two novelists here to talk about their historicals, Dexter Pamer and Rishi Reddi. Dexter is the author of Mary Toft, or The Rabbit Queen, and Rishi is the author of Passage West. And they're here to talk with Daphne Kalotay. I'll hold up Dexter's book. Mary Toft, or The Rabbit Queen, is a historical novel set in the early 1700s England about a woman who is given birth to rabbits. Whether this is a medical miracle or a hoax or some sort of shared delusion, or just a few of the questions this remarkable novel asks us. NPR called it a daring narrative leap and praised its lush detail and vivid characterizations. Dexter is the author of two previous novels, Version Control, which was selected as one of the best novels of 2016 by GQ and the San Francisco Chronicle, and The Dream of Perpetual Motion. He lives in Princeton, New Jersey. Rishi Reddi's Passage West here takes the reader on a sweeping journey that follows a family of Punjabi sharecroppers, their in-laws and neighbors at the onset of World War I in California, revealing a little-known aspect of America's past. Publishers Weekly said Rishi Reddi's Steinbeckian tale vividly evokes the landscape and the characters' place in it. Rishi is also the author of Karma and Other Stories. She has worked as an environmental lawyer for more than 25 years, and she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dexter and Rishi are in conversation tonight with Daphne Kalotay, who some of you know. She is the author of the novels Sight Reading and Russian Winter, and the story collection Calamity and Other Stories. She lives outside Boston and teaches at Princeton University's program in creative writing. We'll have a Q&A following their discussion. I hope you will all contribute to that. Feel free to submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the information bar, which is at the bottom of your screen. A quick note about some programs coming up. We have cookbook author and chef Rick Rogers this Saturday at 3 p.m. We have Ayad Ashtar talking about his Homeland Elegies this Tuesday at 7 p.m. And Russell Shorto is talking about his book, Small Time, this Wednesday at 7 p.m., among many others. All of our programs are free, but you'll need to register online the day before the event. Also, remember our online specialty bookstore. Proceeds from this book sale and donations go to the Academy, programming, and our budget, so these events and the funds they raise are really crucial for us. Please visit us on the web at spencertownacademy.org for information about the book festival and the book sale and much more. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Rishi, Dexter, and Daphne.
Thank you so much to David, to Rishi, and to Dexter for being here. And welcome everybody also that we cannot see. But we're delighted that you're here and to talk about these wonderful novels, which we've brought together because they are both inspired by true episodes in history. And as David mentioned, Dexter's is inspired by this episode in 1726 that happened in a town in England where this woman repeatedly gave birth to rabbits. And Rishi's writing about men who came from Punjabi to California's Empire Valley as farmers in the early 20th century. And what I'd like to start with is to give everyone a taste of both of these novels, which are slightly different in flavor and in texture. So what I'd love to do is if each of you could quickly introduce your books with a brief excerpt. Dexter, if you could please go first, and then Rishi.
Okay, I am going to read the first section of the first chapter. which takes place in this what was then a rural English town of Godalming, but which is now basically a suburb of London, but was not in 1726. So, Chapter 1, the exhibition of medical curiosities. The convoy of 9 decrepit coaches and wagons that constituted Nicholas Fox's exhibition of medical curiosities rolled into the village of Godalming on a Friday in early September 1726, soon after sunrise. Its herald, careening headlong before the horses that pulled the lead coach, was a young blonde girl whose face was half covered by a port wine stain, one of her sky blue eyes peering out of an inky blotch of burgundy. Tomorrow, witness a series of physiological wonders of which I am the very least, she proclaimed to passers-by, the men and women trudging out of town to begin the day's harvest of the hop fields. For the meager price of 6pence, gaze upon the horrific consequences that occur when the Lord God stretches out his mighty finger and lays a curse on man. Educational for the mind, edifying for the soul. The windows of the coaches had their thick black curtains pulled, proof against stray glimpses of their passengers. Education and edification would not come for free. Zachary Walsh, at age 14, the proud apprentice of Mr. John Howard, Godalming's finest and only surgeon, stood before the window of his loft in the Howard's home and watched the procession roll by on the street beneath him, imagining what grotesque secrets and horrors might stuff the carriages. Was it not his duty as an initiate into the surgeon's craft to be medically curious? It was. Granted, even after 4 months of learning the trade, the sight of blood still turned his stomach. Just last week, he'd tasted bile at the back of his throat while watching Howard patiently stitch shut a gash in a farmer's calf, laid open by the blade of a wayward scythe. Howard had punched the needle back and forth through the man's torn flesh as easily as if it were burlap, seeing the blood and not seeming to care. You'll be as hardened to this as I am, soon enough, he'd said, his voice infused with an unexpected melancholy that Zachary couldn't understand. But Zachary's squeamishness did not preclude a love of mystery, and the drawn curtains of the coaches promised more profound alterations of the human shape than mere swollen stomachs or broken bones. Knowledge of strange, unknown anatomies, yes, sights to steel the spirit against sin as well, but also nightmares. The most delicious nightmares, the kind that one has only after the wall between the mundane and the magical is breached directly before one's eyes. Nightmares that make you smile as you shiver in your sleep. As if sensing the turn of Zachary's thoughts from a distance, the girl with the birthmark spattered across her face left her place at the head of the parade of vehicles and ran back along the train, coming to a stop beneath Zachary's window. Standing in the street, the last dust clouds that trailed behind the convoy swirling about the hem of her pale yellow skirts, she impulsively cast her gaze around her. Then she looked up at Zachary, screwed her face into a grimace, and hissed at him as if he were a disobedient cat. Tss, tss. Zachary involuntarily stepped backward, briefly fearing some kind of malediction, then feeling foolish because his fear had shown on his face, and she had seen it. Then, giggling, the girl scampered away to announce the exhibition's coming.
Thank you. Wonderful. And Rishi, you want to go ahead?
So Passage West, thank you, Daphne. Passage West is set in 1915 in far Southern California on the border with Mexico. And it's centered around a man named Karak, and who has recently immigrated from Punjab. And he is working on his cousin's cantaloupe farm, and he meets a Mexican woman there. And this is the story of their first date. Karak hitched up the mare and came to fetch Rosa in the buckboard, having packed the picnic himself. and they went to the only park east of the tracks, situated between the Negro settlement and Chinatown. When he realized that too many people would be watching them, a turbaned Hindu consorting with a Mexicana, he turned out of town and went along the dirt path that led to the new plank road. He wished he had a machine, one of those new models that were being snapped up more quickly than Ford could make them. That would impress Rosa. He was sure of it. "Why are you courting me?" she asked as they began to eat. Carrick's fluency in Spanish came and went. At this question, he stammered, then felt a moment of lightness and laughed when she did. Then he was bothered by that laugh. Was she making fun of him? Did she not think him manly? He had brought roti and beans, trying to cook something close to Mexican food in an effort to show that they could be familiar. But Rosa was taunting him, giggling. "I'm a Mexican girl and you are a Hindu." He corrected her, telling her he was Sikh, not Hindu. That was why he wore the turban. That was why he wore the iron bangle. "Then why do they call you Hindu?" she asked. "I do not know." Then he laughed, though he was disheartened by her question. "We are from Hindustan, so we are Hindu, maybe." He looked at her. "We call ourselves Hindustani." She did not seem to understand the nuance. "So I'm a Mexican girl and you are a Sikh." "Don't we live in America?" he asked, "where we are equal?" "Does equal mean we mix like this?" she asked back. Later that afternoon, they drove the buckboard into El Centro. They went as far as the furniture store where the wealthy Anglos shopped, much farther than they would have wandered on any working day. Through the window, they saw the Persian rugs hanging in the back, a mock room displayed with a home telephone hanging on the wall, a showroom for faucets and sinks. "So many beautiful things," Rosa exclaimed. "I can buy them all for you," he said. She was still looking through the window when she said, dreaming, distracted, "We will have such beautiful children." That was when Carrick knew. A moment later, the pink came to her face and she giggled. Her eyes darted around as if she did not know exactly where she was. She hadn't meant the thought to be articulated. She turned away. "You feel so sure about me?" he asked, but he was talking to her back. Her hat sat at an innocent angle. "Yes," she whispered. "Why?" he asked. "Because of the harvest last spring. I saw how you acted when Senor Cruz fell in the field. You have a good heart, a strong heart. You jumped on the horse and went immediately to fetch the doctor, like a son." Goodwill swept through him. He had not even wanted to ride for the doctor for Senor Cruz that day, but as he gazed at Rosa's back and shoulders, he thought he could be who she thought he was. Stop it.
Thank you so much. And I think where I'd like to start, because these are both based on real events and in some cases real people, I think people would like to know not only how and when you first came across these stories, but more importantly, probably how you knew that you wanted to and that you could do something with these in the form of fiction. So whoever wants to go first. I know this is a big question. These are big books, and it takes something to transform, right?
Well, I can go first. I came across this Mary Toft story and mentioned in a course in graduate school. I took a course on 18th century literature, and it was just mentioned one week. And back when I was in grad school, I didn't have any intention of writing an entire novel about this, but I just sort of mentally filed it away. And in that sort of academic pack rat sort of way, whenever I came across material that related to it, I would just sort of file it away. So after a number of years, I had like some associated material. And then after I completed my second novel, I had a meeting with my editor, and we were talking about what to do next. And I said, "Well, I have this crazy idea. It's based on a true story about a woman who gave birth to, or hoaxed people into believing that she gave birth to 17 rabbits." And it was a nice sort of change of pace for me from my previous two books, which were speculative fiction, to doing this kind of thing. And I thought that it was a good opportunity for a novelist rather than a historian, because there is enough material about Mary Toft for, like, say, an article or a chapter in a book, but there's not enough for a straight biography, which is a liability for a historian, but an asset for a novelist who can just make things up to sort of fill in the gaps. And so I found myself, filling in the gaps and adhering as closely to what I believed to be fact as I could. But that gave me license to do like sort of like interiority, like what characters are thinking about, which you wouldn't be able to do as a historian.
Great. Yes, thank you.
I had a similar experience, Dexter. I also learned about the whole population in that part of Imperial Valley through a law school course when I was learning about citizenship law, and the fact that a particular individual named Bhagat Singh Thind had gained he was from Punjab, and he had gained American citizenship, and then had it rescinded, taken away, and then he appealed that, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So I had no idea that there had been this population pre-World War I, around turn of the century, of South Asians living in the United States. My family came in 1971, soon after the immigration doors opened again in 65. And we sort of that was a point of pride for us that we were, quote, one of the first. And in fact, here was this population that had been here 70 years prior. So I started to do some research on him and tucked it away in that same sort of like academic way, and then learned about these things like these crop seizures, that there was a lot of racial disparity in terms of the makeup of the valley, and the way that as the white population, the settler population there became more and more empowered, that there were crop seizures for the recent immigrants that had happened in that location. There had been killings because of the crop seizures, people sort of battling back from that. I mean, it seemed like a time of intense activity, like the miscegenation laws were in effect. So sometimes they couldn't find spouses amongst the population, they could not marry. And then there were all of these other things that were happening in terms of people of certain races not being able to have long-term leases on farmland and be farmers, and then the Asian exclusion law. So it seemed like just so full of activity, and the more I read about it, the more I thought like, oh my gosh, I have to include that in the novel, and I have to include this in the novel. And then it turns out there was a whole bunch of Indian revolutionaries who were battling against the British colonials on the subcontinent, who were using California as a place to raise funds and to educate people. So all of this got folded in and interspersed with, fact and fiction. And it did leave a lot of room for imagination, as you say, Dexter, but I really grappled with, I felt a little bit of the tyranny of the truth. How am I gonna handle these really true events that I thought warranted, they needed to be portrayed accurately, but I wanted this other space too. So that was one of the challenges of the novel, the imaginative space. So
yeah, I found when I was first starting this book that I knew quite a lot less about the period than I thought I did. And during like the first, I think, about year of writing, I would get through about a paragraph a day, because I realized I didn't know important things like how many windows a house would have, or like what a house is shaped like, what medicine was like during the period. And I had this brief, I mean, as I always do with every book, or have had with every book so far, this brief period where I thought I have no idea what I've gotten myself into. But I did sort of, when I was reading your book, Rishi, it reminded me of, I've had like a number of years ago, I got William Vollmann's nonfiction book, Imperial, about the Imperial Valley, which is like this huge, thick
Huge
thing.
tome. I have it. It's right here.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I can't claim to have completed reading it.
Neither
but,
can I. Yeah.
but I do remember him making the case that that he wanted to write at length about the Imperial Valley because he found it to be a microcosm of American history in that way. And it seemed like you were sort of gesturing in like that same direction.
I felt the same as I learned more and more about it, and the you know, what started out as what were to be family plots of land and family farms, you know, agribusiness comes in, and then suddenly, you know, when the man appears, everything shifts and people's places in society shift. One of the things I admired, Dexter, about your ability to go that far into the past was the syntax of the words, you know, how you were rendering dialogue. I wouldn't know how to begin that. I mean, I just feel like we're talking about almost 300 years ago, you know, I found myself thinking about, how did you get that syntax, and how did you think about how you were going to lay down thoughts in how English may or must have been spoken at that time? You know, that was a difficulty for me. I was wondering how you may have handled it.
Well, two things. First, I was just, during the period I was reading mostly 18th century writing. And so that sort of soaked into like the rhythms of the sentences and things like that. I think compared to, and this is perhaps a little technical, but that's what we want, I think. The sentences, compared to my other books, the sentences tend to run a little bit longer. The paragraphs run a little bit longer. There are more like semicolons and em dashes and things like that. The other thing that I did was I used this subsite of Google called Google Ngrams, which if you type in a word, it'll display like a graph that records the incidence of that word in their corpus of text over time. And so one of the things that I was careful to do was not use any words that didn't actually exist in 1726, which meant that I needed to, there was one section where I wanted to use the word like financier or something like that. And I had to find some sort of elliptical way of describing this concept without using like the actual word. And that, I think, I mean, it was tedious to do until I sort of got used to doing it, but that was a thing that sort of helped with like finally shaping the style of it.
I had no idea such a tool existed. Wow, what a great thing. That's a great little tidbit you just shared. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and it's funny, the French translation is coming out next year, and when I picked the translator for it because I'd worked with her before, and I said, you know, Aunt Sylvia's her name, and I said to her that there's this thing that I would like you to do that might be somewhat annoying, which is that I want you to make sure that all of the words you use exist in 1726 French. And so she went and got like a French dictionary from the period, and has been, I believe, sort of cross-checking it to make sure that like that conceptually translates over.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, it's not only the vocabulary, but it's the overall tone and the omniscient narration. I mean, I feel, and this is something I would say for both of your books actually, that the form matches the content and the era. You've both written books that I think mirror the time period that you're writing about. You know, I mean, the minute that you enter that excerpt that you read, Dexter, you know, that light omniscient tone, right? We feel like we're entering that time period. And Rishi, yours too. I feel there is an earnestness to the way your characters speak. There's, you've written this big, capacious novel that to me feels like something that a character in the early 20th century who was reading a novel of that time, I mean, that's what they would be reading. They would not be reading some thin, this wide novel that we're reading now that's really, edgy and sarcastic, So I feel, that your novel to me feels that that in some way is actually reflecting its era. I feel that coming through in every chapter.
Mhm.
I don't know. I guess I'm asking this as a question: to what degree you were consciously reflecting that, or reflecting on that as you were writing, and how long it took you to find the form.
I felt like that was, I didn't feel like I was consciously trying to write a novel of that era, but I did feel that this topic was weighty and it required a certain treatment. So perhaps it was more of that than the actual era that influenced it. But Daphne, you raised an interesting question about, is that something historical novels should do, to try to stylistically, should they even be from the era in which they that they're trying to depict? I don't know. I don't think that I thought of that consciously at all.
I thought it felt exactly like an early 20th century American novel.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah. I had assumed that you had like made actual decisions to sort of to pay homage to that style. Like just generally the idea that I mean, at a larger level, like the way that your characters are not just characters, but your interest seems to be in providing a sense of place, and showing like how a system works, which is something I associate with like novels of that period. I mean, in my own for my own instance, I can say that I found writing in the omniscient style, like in this omniscient voice, to be very liberating, because suddenly you don't have to, when you're not sort of locked to the perspective of a single character, suddenly, like if any character has a thought, you can just read it into the record. Or if you yourself want a text to possibly be read in a certain way, you can read that into the record too. I don't know why people don't do that anymore.
It's such a good question.
Yeah.
It's such a good question.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also like to point out that these books also feel utterly contemporary in terms of their subject matter. Dexter, your book came out in 2019, but when you read it now, we see all of these powerful men getting behind a completely preposterous and obviously untrue
Mhm.
statement, right? And going to great lengths to prove that it's true. So, I think it's kind of impossible to read this book and not think about the big lie. And I feel like even when you were writing this, of course, the election hadn't happened yet, but the former president was already prepping for, stop the steal kind of narratives. So I don't know, were you already thinking about that when you were writing this?
I wish I could claim that I was. I started writing it in spring 2016. And at the time I thought I was almost completely sure that I knew how the future would turn out. And of course, the future did not turn out in the way that I thought. And I can't claim that like I was consciously thinking about that during the years I was writing. And in fact, writing this book was sort of a refuge from reading the paper every day. And yet, like many readers have commented that I seem to be covertly writing about the former president, so to speak, or like the kind of thinking that went on in certain circles during that period. It may just be, here's one way to say it. So when I finished like turning in the book, I had this conversation with my editor and my agent, and my editor said, "This is an important book, Dexter." And then he said, "Nobody ever writes an important book on purpose. It's always by accident." So.
Well, I'm astounded to hear this, Dexter, because as I was going through those pages, I thought for sure that what you were shedding a light on was just the cynics around the lying and around how we manipulate folks to get them to believe what we want them to believe. I mean, I actually flipped to the front of the book at one point to see when the copyright was, to see how it would have coincided with the whole 4 years of the former administration, to see. And I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, did he write this book that fast? So I'm astounded to hear, but there's another, I've heard a couple of writers who are perhaps a generation older than us tell me often about how we pick up stuff that's floating in the air as part of our imaginative exercise and put it down on paper without even knowing that we're doing that. Mm-hmm. And it feels like there might have been some of that. Like you may have been avoiding the newspapers, but you may have been writing about what the newspapers were actually reporting.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps, yeah.
Well, and Rishi, you were writing about distrust of immigrants, right? And people working actively to change laws, right? And rewrite laws. And you started this book years ago.
Yeah,
so,
half a generation ago. Yeah, I mean, I started the book in probably in earnest in 2005, 2006. It took me a long time to research it, partially because there was so much more information coming to light year after year about that early South Asian population. So I just, as I said before, was trying to include it, but it wasn't until the happenings of 2016 that I feel that the book really took more solid shape, that I realized like, oh, here's all this information that I have and the way that life was back then. And I had looked at all these primary sources, newspapers being a key component, even things like song lyrics and even tons and tons of photographs. But it's kind of the opposite of what Dexter has said. It was pretty conscious of me that when I realized 2016 came around and I had something that I really wanted to say about it, and I found I had all this material that was already saying it, and it gave it a more solid shape.
And you, even in your book, I love this, you include some snippets of articles, political cartoon, some song lyrics, poetry quotes.
It was too good to pass up. I mean, it was telling the story, that first, way that journalism is called the first draft of history. It was telling the story itself. I didn't need to doctor it in any way. I think I changed the name of the newspaper, and then I put in a made up name, but the article I would, appeared verbatim as it came in on the Brawley News. So, yeah, for sure. It was like a replay of some of the things that the country had been founded on, that we were sort of telling. We had recycled it, and then we were going to tell the same story again in 2016, that we had told whatever 70 years prior or whatever it was.
Yeah. I'm wondering, could you share with people also, because I know that you actually went to California and you met with some descendants of people who were part of this narrative.
Yeah, it was really meaningful for me, Daphne. I met with, so a lot of these families had fathers who were from Punjab and mothers who were from Mexico, and the mothers had crossed the border during the Mexican Revolution. And at the time that I first reached out to them, which would have been in the early 90s, mid 90s, they were, because I had sort of started talking to these folks at that time, and then really started the research in the mid 2000s, like 2005, 2006. And they were able to tell me the real life stories of their parents. They were aging at the same time. So it was sort of a generation who had known these actual folks who were starting to, they were advanced in years. But there was a real life murder that took place in the Valley at that time. And I met the children, who were involved, who were the children of the folks who had been fired at, at gunpoint and things like that. So it was really meaningful for me to interact with these folks. I mean, they welcomed me with open arms, and they told me all these stories. Like, they had me over for dinner. I stayed in their home. I mean, they even put me in touch with their first cousins who were in Punjab. So, one brother stayed in India, one brother had come to Imperial Valley, and they invited me to go to Punjab and visit the family on the other side so that I could see what the effect of all that money was that they had earned here, and what that brought about in India as that money got sent back, that tie between the families and what it meant to a small village in Punjab that they had sent a couple of their sons over here. So it was really meaningful to me, that piece of the research.
There's also, I think, or I imagine, a sense of duty as well. Once you've spoken to people, then it's, better finish the book.
About the tear. I know. First, so I couldn't, put the book down after that and then talk about the tyranny of the truth. Right? To know actual people whose histories were bound up in this. Yeah, you could not put that away.
No, I was just thinking about, I mean, Dexter, I don't know, maybe there is somebody just many, many, many generations later, but I'm assuming you were feeling much freer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes about, or during the writing process, I thought about, because I did not do any field work for this book. And I thought, can I get away without doing that? And then I thought about Prescott's History of the Conquest of Mexico, which has all these lovely landscape descriptions, despite the fact that Prescott never went to Mexico and was also blind. And so I thought, if he can get away with it, I can get away with it.
That's wonderful. Was there anything in your research, I'm wondering, that just either really surprised you or threw you off a little bit? I ask this because I feel that in every project, there's been a moment where something derailed me momentarily and I had to get over it.
There was one thing that I tried to include but could not find space for, which is the fact that, as I found during my research, that during the time that these events were happening in London, both Voltaire and Handel lived in London. Voltaire having been in exile, and Handel was having an opera performed there. And I thought it would be nice to sort of like engineer some sort of inclusion of these characters in there. And I made a pass at it, and there were two problems. First, it just seemed like you could see my hand moving the characters around too much. And secondly, if you're going to write Voltaire as a character, then you have to be as good as Voltaire, which is extremely difficult, it turns out. So I figured I would just like cut my losses on that score. Yeah.
What about you, Rishi? Was there anything?
I think I had a similar thing where I wanted to include the story of one of the Punjabi patriarch's wife and how she made her way here from India. And I found that I had a really hard time being able to incorporate that story into the rest of the narrative. And I had the entire story, and I ended up not being able to include all of it. And then I had some scenes about the soldiers in World War I in France. at one of the major battles. And I felt in the end, I had to do something like stage direction and stay in the Imperial Valley. Like I couldn't follow characters all the way across the world and have a scene there and then bring them back. So I was sad about that, but ultimately I think it was for the best because the book probably still wouldn't be out yet.
I know that there are a few questions from the audience, and I have some more questions too. But I think maybe what I will do is I'll ask one more and then I'll have David start taking the audience questions. My question for you is that I know that these books were both very different from your previous works. Rishi, you had written a collection of short stories. Now you wrote this capacious novel, and Dexter, you'd written speculative fiction, and then you moved into this historical fiction. So I'm wondering what you had to learn in order to write these different books.
Well, in my case, it's funny. I did find, and this helped a little bit, that speculative fiction and historical fiction largely trade on the same skill set. And one way to explain that is that for both of them, you're describing a world that neither the reader nor the author has firsthand experience with. And so the tricks that you would use or techniques that you would use in speculative fiction to make that world seem convincing also apply to historical fiction. The difference is that if you're writing something in the future and you don't know what something looks like or how things work, you can just sort of make it up. Whereas here I felt like I was sort of bound to the library because I had this idea that, you know, eventually like an expert in the field is going to read this and then like sort of complain pretty loudly that I got something wrong. So I had like a certain sort of nervousness during this that I normally haven't had with, like, to that extent with my other books.
That's so interesting, Dexter, because the first editor who bought this book, whom I adore, said to me one time when we were walking together, she said, "Are you scared you're going to get something wrong?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, let me tell you right now, you're going to get something wrong." So that was really great. But I also, you know, I just think that my first collection of short stories were very much here and now, and they were very much based in personal experience. But I was trying to use them as exercises, sort of, since I was so new to writing then, I was trying to teach myself, well, can I write in the voice of an elderly man? Can I write in the voice of, you know, a 14-year-old boy? Or could I write, like, can I write from the perspective of a middle-aged woman, which I wasn't then at the time, like I am now. And so that was a jump for me. It was, I almost felt like when I started this novel that I was in this new space. But I also want to say that there was a weird relevance, which I think you alluded to, Daphne, with a historical novel. You're both writing in the time period of which you're writing about, but you're also writing about today, you know, all the time. And I found myself in this weird, I feel, metaphysical space. And Dexter, there's a quote that you have near the end of your book that I just want to write, because I just want to read for folks, because I felt like when I read it, it's on page 270, but it's very short, and I'll read it to folks here. I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I've been doing. Like, this is what it was like to write this novel. And you say, history is an act of continuous collective imagining, and the perception of truth is a constant, unending negotiation with others and with oneself when one is alone. And I thought, that's what I felt like I was doing with all of these primary sources and the newspapers that I had. And yet nobody knew that these South Asians were in the country then. Like, it was an unheard of history. And I went back into the past and found all of this evidence. Oh my gosh, these men and a few women were walking around here, you know, and I thought, like, that quote is exactly what the experience of writing this historic novel was like for me. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, we can take questions from the audience now.
There's some good ones here. This is a question for Rishi, actually. Were any of the other characters aside from B.S. Thind real people or composites of other historical figures? If so, did you speak with any descendants of those people? You've sort of answered one of those questions, but what about the first one?
So Bhagat Singh Thind, B.S. Thind, he was actual historical figure for sure. And he was a person of prominence even after the court case. You know, he sort of had this whole career as a lecturer, you know, on the circuit. There's another figure who comes on earlier on in the novel, who he's going through all of California, Oregon, Washington, trying to recruit people for, you know, this Revolutionary Army that eventually got sent back to India to fight against the British. And the whole scheme was, you know, found out, and the British got them, and a lot of those men were hung, and, you know, or they were sent back to Punjab. So that figure was real as well. And then a lot of the incidents in the novel, like even the smaller incidents, were things that were based in very large part on what people told me. You know, I feel like in some weird way, my imagination didn't have to work too hard in thinking up the incidents. It had to work hard in describing the setting and what they were like. But the incidents themselves are quite true, you know, of people reporting them to me.
And that comes across for sure. This is a question for you, Dexter, and it's about Zachary and John Howard, two of the central characters. And I guess I was thinking that both of them are sort of the primary points of view a little bit, or certainly Zachary is one, a little more intimate, a little more personal. John is his boss, the surgeon in the small town, is a little bit more aloof. How did you, it's interesting that you have someone as young as Zachary as a teenager, kind of as a big point of view with so much going on culturally and the medicine and the hoax stuff. How did Zachary come to you, and how did you think of him when you were starting this book?
Well, it's I had this when I first started to like pitch this as a book to my publisher, my editor and my agent and I, we had lunch and we had like this talk about how the book was going to be shaped. And we just kind of hammered it out like pretty quickly in like an hour. And one of the things that we sort of mutually came up with at once was that if there was a kid or a teenager in the narrative, then that person could act as a proxy for the reader, because it would be reasonable for him to ask questions about the world. And that would be a way for John to explain how the world works to him, and therefore to the reader. Because he's innocent in two senses, both like sort of like morally and also like he just doesn't know things. And so so what he allows me to do is sort of tell the reader things without sounding like sort of condescending, and also make it natural for this sort of dialogue to be sort of inserted into the narrative.
Makes perfect sense. That's great. Really interesting. This is a question for Rishi, and it's about all of the sense of place you talked about before is palpable in this story. The dust, the heat, the verdant land, the crops, all of it. So well done and so interesting. This is a question from Jill. Did you have to study to learn about farming cantaloupes and lettuce and cotton to be able to convincingly depict the work that they do in this book?
Oh my gosh, Jill, I learned so much about farming when I was writing this novel. And I say this even having spent a good portion of my growing up years in Kansas. I was pretty embarrassed at how little I knew about actual farming life, you know. So yeah, I did. And the distinctions between the different crops and what makes them vulnerable to weather and which crops are not vulnerable to weather, And then I thought, am I going to really bore my readers with this? And I thought, I probably am going to bore some, but I also felt like it was a part of the flavor of the book. It was the pace of life then. It was determined by these things. So then I started to really, the environmental side of me took over, and I took a real pleasure in that, I think, ultimately, but I had doubts about it at first, that type of research.
It
Oh, I
was
loved all
also
that fussy mechanical stuff. It was fun.
And it was important because I think also one of the messages is that the immigrants also bring with them techniques that they bring to America, right? I mean, Tom, the Japanese character, right? He brings, he changes how something's done. I'm forgetting if it's
Yeah,
with the
he
cantaloupes
makes
or the lettuce.
Yes, yes. No, it's really true. And what I learned about it was actually what meant a lot to me is, I was talking about land and who belongs to what land. That idea of nativism versus, where do foreigners belong? Where do indigenous people belong? That type of thing. But what happens through farming is it's the interaction of people and the land. And the crops that we eat today are the result of generations of decisions that our ancestors made. I mean, like 500, 600, 1,000 years ago. The crops we eat now are influenced by how they decided to grow the predecessors of these vegetables and fruits that we eat. That had great meaning for me, in the context of the novel of, who is influencing the land and where they are, so I felt in the end it was really part and parcel of the narrative.
Very interesting. This is a question for you, Dexter, and it's about some of these characters, and I think some of the broadest characters are the ones that just I could tell you were having so much fun with, were some of these doctors, the doctors sent by the king, Nathaniel St. Andre, and then there is Richard Manningham, right? Were they based on historical characters at all? And did you have fun writing those guys?
Yeah, those three characters are basically like they're St. Andre and Manningham and Ehlers we're all real doctors. They're also like sort of a composite of, say, like a total of I believe 7 doctors who attended Toft. And I sort of basically assigned them 3 like sets of characteristics so that I could contrast them with each other. The documents that St. Andre is depicted as writing in the text, many of them are actually like real extant documents. And Manningham wrote on this case as well. That's it. I did have fun sort of putting words in their mouth, so to speak, and writing 3 sets of distinct voices for them, such that like the target is that you can identify these characters without knowing their names by how they speak. Getting that down was a challenge, and it was fun to get that, completed.
I bet. I can imagine. Rishi, this is the question for you, and it's I'm not sure how to phrase it, but it's about voice, and I feel like there's so many characters in your novel. It's a big cast, and they all have their own voice and are just so convincing. I'm thinking about the letters that you created for Ram. Is that how you say his name? Is it Ram or Ram?
Yeah, Ram.
Ram. The voice of the letters between Ram and Karak that open the novel and really continue through the novel. And another scene that's really standing out to me is the Japanese family. And this is a point where one of the young men who's been to war comes back and brings Brett back to this Japanese family, and to the mother particularly, a necklace and letters that his friend Harry, who's died in war, has wanted us to bring back to the family. Anyway, I have the sense that you see these people, but their language and the way they express themselves feels so distinctive. Was that just native for you? Did that just sort of come out of you, or did you have to work hard at some of these characters and their speech and some of those scenes?
Well, just on a very superficial level, because there were so many different cultures at play here, when I had the text written, I went to some real trusted cultural reviewers and had them help me with the syntax of the different languages, because I wanted to convey accent, and I wanted to convey it accurately. Like, what would a Japanese speaker who spoke Japanese as their first language, how would that syntax play itself out in English? Like, how could I convey accent? And I did that with the Spanish. I did that a little less with the Punjabi. I was a little more comfortable with that. But so they helped me for sure. And I couldn't have done that without them. The other portion was, I was born in India and I grew up here, but my parents very much speak with Indian syntax and with an Indian accent in English, which, English there is almost a native language. I mean, it's been spoken there for longer than it's been spoken in the United States because of the length of the colonial government there. But I wanted to show, one of the things that I felt I wanted to play with was the way that mainstream America views immigrants. And part of that is through language and the way that people there's an impulse immediately to sort of look down on, or perhaps feel that certain accents not only are, quote, inferior in the way that they're, portrayed in English, but that actually people have this involuntary notion that the mind behind that language is inferior, right? This is the origin of xenophobia. Right? It's not the origin, but it's one of the symptoms that plays out. So what I wanted to do, and I felt like I could do, the privilege of a novelist, is to show the immense world and intellect behind a certain mind, and then have that person speak in English in the accent. And I wanted to make people feel uncomfortable about that they would be inside this person's mind and experience the world through that person. And then when they're expressing themselves in English, they express in accent. And then so that people have that moment of like, oh my gosh, I've done that, because you know what, I've done that. So that was one of my, why I wanted that dialect to appear on the page in that way.
Yeah, it was very smart of you to have that checked, because often as readers, we're reading what we think is a dialect and it just doesn't ring true, even though it's not our dialect, but somehow it just doesn't feel as convincing. But it's just interesting. I saw that immediately, as I say, with these letters that kind of opened the novel. Really beautifully done. We're going to close in just a few minutes, but if anybody else has a question, please chime in if you'd like to. There is one more question about research, and this is one for you, Rishi. This book took you many years. I mean, more than 10 years, it sounds like, if you were interviewing some families in the 90s. How did you decide to begin? And when did you decide that this was really, you were going to sit down and write, that you're going to write a novel with this? How did that decision come to you?
When I first sat down to write, it was a much smaller book, and I had interviewed a couple of the families and just started around the character of Ram, who's not I didn't read about him today, but he is the good friend of Karak, who's the other male protagonist. And it was going to just be a love story. So I started thinking about that love story, and I thought I was ready to write it. And it was only over time that, it took on all of these other facets. So I don't know how to answer that question other than I thought, oh, I know enough for the love story. Now I'm just going to start that, and it turned out to be just a small piece of the larger.
And sometimes it's the magic of writing. You're writing and then other things come to you, of course, always. Well, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. These two novels are so interesting and so different and varied, but certainly speak to us in this modern age. As Daphne said, they feel, even though they're historical, they feel so modern in some ways, and that's a tribute to the sensitivity and alertness of both of you to these stories. So thank you so much for coming. And
Thank
to
you,
everybody
David.
you're so welcome. And to everybody who is listening, please visit us on the web, spencertownacademy.org, for the rest of the programming coming up and the online book sale. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.